Political borders in 20th century Europe are usually thought of as lines on a map separating one nation-state from another. However, there are many borderlands and border zones where belonging is ambiguous, arbitrary, or unstable. Throughout the 20th century, European borders shifted repeatedly, and some have re-emerged or continued to divide people long after being dismantled. What borders mean and how they are represented has also changed over time. This chapter and video lecture examines both how European borders have changed over the course of the 20th century, and it shows also what they have meant and how they have been represented at different times. There were three major waves of border changes in 20th century Europe. The first one in 1919-1918, after the First World War, after the Second World War, after 1945, and then after the end of the Cold War, after the 1989-91 period. Going in order, the First World War led to the disintegration of land empires within Europe and the creation of new nation-states from their former domains. For populations that had long felt stifled under rule by distant powers, the 1918 Versailles Peace Conference presented an opportunity for national self-determination that would bring similar people together within independent states. For others, especially minorities and the inhabitants of mixed regions like Silesia, of cities like Danzig, now Gdansk in Poland, Trieste, and Salonika, respectively, Trieste and Thessaloniki, new borders could mean lost rights, dispossessions, or forced migration. Conflicts over borders nevertheless continued between the two world wars. Hitler's annexation of Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia in 1938 were but a prelude to a larger war in which both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union engaged in large-scale social engineering projects that violently altered the ethnic composition of Europe, including the systematic killing and displacement of Europe's Jewish population. By the time the Second World War ended, millions of people had been murdered, deported, or displaced. After the Allies defeated the Axis powers, they drafted a blueprint for the post-war settlement at the Potsdam Conference in 1945, which rearranged the continent's internal borders. The Allies' plans quickly became a rigid reality as conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States led to the indefinite postponement of a final peace treaty. In occupied Germany, the Western and Soviet occupation zones became separate states that competed with one another for nearly 40 years. During the Cold War, therefore, few European borders changed substantially. But in 1989, the unexpected collapse of the Berlin Wall and later of the Soviet Union called into question both the placement and meaning of borders across Europe. Several momentous changes followed. East and West Germany united, the Czech Republic and Slovakia separated, the USSR dissolved, and Yugoslavia disintegrated. Thereafter, large parts of Europe became more closely integrated within the structure of the European Union. Today's European Union was founded originally in 1957 as they were known at the time as the European Communities, or EC, by 6 Western member states. But it expanded in 4 key stages. First, there was the so-called Northern Enlargement in 1973, through which Denmark, Ireland, and the United Kingdom became EC members. This was followed by the so-called Mediterranean enlargements, which added Greece in 1981 and Portugal and Spain in 1986, marking an important milestone also in this country's transition from dictatorship to democracy. This was followed then by the accession of Austria, Finland, and Sweden, all countries that had pursued a policy of neutrality during the Cold War, and they joined what was the renamed and restructured European Union created by the Maastricht Treaty in 1993. And of course, the long Eastern enlargement, which brought in 10 new members in 2004, followed by 2 more in 2007, and last but not least, Croatia in 2013. These changes have not only changed the location of the European Union's external borders to the north, the south, and the east, but they also affected how its internal borders work. A milestone in this regard was the signing of the Schengen Agreement in 1985, which aimed to abolish checks at shared borders and create a single external border, and which entered into force between some countries in 1995, gradually expanding to encompass most, but not all, EU states and some non-EU members, such as Norway and Switzerland, promising the free movement of some 400 million people within the so-called Schengen area. The process of EU integration has undeniably reduced barriers to trade and individual mobility between European states, but the practice has not always lived up to the loftier expectations. EU states have suspended Schengen and reintroduced temporary border controls, for example, in advance of international summits or in response to terrorism, and sometimes also for extended periods, such as 2015, when they closed the borders to refugees seeking asylum from civil wars in Northern Africa and the Middle East, a practice that made critics speak of a so-called fortress Europe. So in short, the history of Europe's internal and external borders is also the history of their simultaneously inclusive and exclusive meanings, and these continue to evolve. Because borders are much more than just a line of division and an administrative tool of territorialization. It's not just a form of controlling space. Some scholars have drawn attention to the prominence and even the agencies of borders in structuring identities and in inciting artistic representations. Others have looked at borders as contact zones and spheres of cultural exchange. And of course, the fact that borders and borderlands can be viewed as landscapes that in many respects were critical and central spaces of a social drama rather than peripheries. The case of the Czech-German border illustrates very well some of these points. Since it is partly formed by mountain ranges, its location has been stable and enduring, but its roles have changed several times. Prior to 1938, it was the state border between Germany and Austria-Hungary. Often more significant, though, was the language border or ethnic boundary that went further inland and which helped to define the so-called borderland, a vast peripheral area that was largely coterminous with German-speaking territories. Between 1938 and 1945, the ethnic boundary became the state border after the signing of the Munich Agreement, which permitted German annexation of the Sudetenland of Western Czechoslovakia. From 1945 to 1948, the state border was restored, but the ethnic boundary was removed following the expulsion of the German population. As a result, the borderland acquired new meaning as a territory to be resettled and cultivated anew. After 1948, that part of the state border which was shared with West Germany became part of the Iron Curtain that separated two competing blocs and their socio-economic systems. The borderland, in the narrow sense of a border zone, turned into a heavily guarded and militarized area. Last but not least, after 1989, the opening of the Czech-German border proceeded in parallel with the general delegitimation of internal borders in Europe, culminating in the Schengen regime. Perhaps more importantly, though, the border finally lost its long-cultivated meaning of an identity-reproducing frontier against the major national enemy. No wonder then that the border was a strong theme of artistic representations ranging from poetry to novels and short stories. There is also a memory of borders, and many Europeans in the 20th century often paid a high price for passing, crossing, or knocking down borders. They were equally aware of the cost of the painful new allegiances that were involved in changes of territory. Several places, such as Berlin, Trieste, Strasbourg, Lviv, which was Lemberg, and Danzig, Gdansk, symbolize the centrality of the border issues in European history. Hence, borders, and above all those that cut and divide, have been evoked in several cultural productions in the 20th century, as they lurk in the recesses of family and collective memories. One example of this is the novel The Divided Sky, 1963, by the German writer Christa Wolf, as also, for example, the passages sculpture, let's call it, by artist Dani Caravan, which is a memorial site built in homage to the German intellectual Walter Benjamin, who tried to escape the Nazis and committed suicide in a Spanish border town in 1940. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961, was long the symbol of inhumanity and oppression par excellence. And conversely, its fall amid the scenes of rejoicing people in November 1989 has allowed it to serve as an icon of passage and a symbol of overcoming arbitrary borders. Another example is the green belt that runs along the former German border, and, for example, also the Berlin Wall Trail for pedestrians and cyclists, which are still today very interesting examples. Regarding the different modes of presence of past borders, the concept of phantom borders is helpful. The term describes former territorial demarcations that seem to re-emerge after periods of disappearance, or at least they seem to keep structuring spaces despite their removal as a result of territorial shifts. Some examples are the abolished borders of empire, Habsburgs, the Ottoman, the German, but also, in a sense, the Soviet Empire as well, and the border dividing Germany from 1949 to 1989, which continue to have a long-lasting effect. So, European borders have generated diametrically opposed responses, from demands for their abolition to measures to reinforce them drastically. In his plea pour l'Europe, for Europe, the French politician Robert Schuman, one of the architects of the European communities, described one of the aims of the process of European integration as finding a medium position between these two poles. And he wrote, "It is not a question of obliterating ethnic and political borders. They are a historical fact, and we do not presume to correct history. What we want to do is to remove the rigidity from borders, what I would call," he wrote, "their intransigent hostility." Borders and boundaries remain, as the French historian Daniel Normand has written, a paradox in space. Borders can be both a front line and a place of encounter, a barrier and a pathway. And the history of Europe in the 20th century demonstrates this only too well.